There are loads of benefits to giving advice. It can help you build good relationships with people, it can help your friends solve problems, and it can even make it look like you know what's going on and your life is not a complete mess. But how do you do that in English? I'm going to tell you. Let's get cracking. Alright mate, thanks for clicking this video. My name is Dan and I'm here to help you stop being an English student and start being an English speaker. In this video, I'm going to show you how to give advice in English. Now the first way I've got for you is to use a modal verb. You know, like should, could, would, ought to, that kind of thing. But when it comes to giving advice in English, we only really need should and ought to. Now, both of these words basically have the exact same meaning, but they're used slightly differently. Let's start with should. We use should when we want to express that we think something is a good idea. And we usually do this with should plus verb, right? You know, should go, should do, should try, should subscribe right now. For example, you could say something like, you should do more exercise, or you should stop smoking, or even something like, you should only drink 10 pints when you go out with your mates. 11 is too much, that's the limit, so just 10, all right? Now when it comes to ought to, it's basically the same. We think it's a good idea, but the grammar is a little bit different. It's ought to verb, you know, ought to go, ought to do, ought to try, ought to subscribe. I already told you. For example, you can say things like, you ought to actually wash your sneakers once every couple of years. They proper stink. Or you ought to try actually leaving your house a couple of times this week. Or maybe you could say something like, you really ought to return that library book that you borrowed in 1997. It's been a long time. Other people are waiting to borrow that book. What's wrong with you? We can use both of these in a negative way when we want to express that something is a bad idea in our opinion. For example, we could say something like, you shouldn't fight your grandma at Thanksgiving. She's like 90. Leave her alone. Or you ought to not try and steal $10 million from the bank because it's a felony and you'll go to prison. Pretty solid advice if you ask me. Next up, we can give advice by turning it into a question, but why would you do that? Well, sometimes we want to make the advice a little bit less direct. Now, in those cases, we actually ask a question that's not really a question, it's just advice that's pretending to be a question. Now, the main way we do this is we use questions like, why don't you verb? For example, why don't you try? Why don't you go? Why don't you subscribe? Why? What have I got to do? Come on! For example, you could say something like, why don't you try actually studying before the test next time? You know, if your friend has completely failed a test and they didn't really study, maybe you want to tell them. And in terms of the grammar, why don't you plus verb? Why don't you try? Why don't you go? Etc. You could also use the phrase, how about, and we usually use that with verb ing. For example, how about actually studying before the test next time? Seriously though, just open your textbook the night before, read a little bit, you'll be fine. Another way we give advice in English is to put yourself in another person's position. Now, I don't mean go and stand where they're standing. It's a bit more metaphorical than that. But when somebody asks you for some advice, it's sometimes a good idea to imagine yourself in that situation and what would you do? And when this happens in English, we often use the expression, if I were you. We can also say, if I were in your shoes. Same thing. And it usually comes in two parts. If I were you, I would blah, 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 blah. For example, if I were you, I'd travel around the world while you're young, because once you've got a wife and a house and kids and a mortgage and all that stuff, you can't afford to travel around the world, mate. You can also use this in a negative way to suggest that something's not a good idea. For example, if I were you, I wouldn't tweet my bank details to all of my followers, because, you know, that's a pretty stupid idea. The next way I've got for you today is to make a suggestion rather than directly giving advice. It's a bit more indirect and we can use it to kind of gently suggest what we think is a good idea rather than telling somebody what to do. To do this, we're going to need to use words like suggest and recommend, and we can say things like, if you want to go to the cup final, I recommend trying to buy tickets in advance, because if you try to go there without a ticket, the guys there will be selling them for 5 times the price. It's a proper rip-off. But when it comes to recommend, you could say something like, I strongly recommend throwing away that milk that's been in your fridge for over a year. It's probably not very good at this point. Can you imagine? Year-old milk. Nah, not for me. Now the next way I've got for you is quite strong. Most of the stuff in this video so far has been a little bit indirect. But now we're not messing about. We're just going straight for it and we're telling the other person exactly what we think because it's important. And to do that, we're going to use the expression, you had better. Be careful with this one though. It is a bit strong, so you need to use it with care. It does feel a little bit like an angry mother shouting at a disobedient child. Maybe the kid has got a bit excited, got their finger paints out and painted a nice picture on the new wallpaper. The mother might say something like, "Oi, you'd better get that cleaned up before your dad gets back from work, otherwise you'll be in real trouble." No, I'm not speaking from experience, I promise. But we can use it normally just to give advice to somebody. You could say something like, you'd better study a little bit harder if you want to pass the TOEIC test. Nice and easy way to give direct advice. Now I do have one last piece of advice for you today. If I were you, I'd watch this video next because it's full of expressions that you can use to have better English conversations. Yeah!